Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your presenters in conference. Please be aware that each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. You may submit your questions electronically anytime by using the Q&A pod located to the left of your webinar. You may also download a copy of today's presentation using the Resources pod located directly below the Q&A pod. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, AHA moderator Drew Solo. Sir, you may begin.
Welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is Drew Solo with Health Forum, part of the American Hospital Association. I'm pleased to be moderating today's webinar event, Boiler Room to Boardroom, Operations Data Executives Care About. This webinar is brought to you through the generous support of Dude Solutions. In healthcare, facilities and executives share the same goal, to provide a safe and healing environment for their patients they serve. However, sometimes it's hard to do that when you aren't on the same page. The fact is, executives oftentimes list facilities as one of their most challenging areas to manage, and facilities departments oftentimes feel they don't have the ability to affect change. So today we'll learn how to align the two. Let me briefly introduce today's speaker. Patrick Tierney is the Enterprise Healthcare Solutions Consultant at Dude Solutions. Patrick conducts product demonstrations for clients, consultations with partners, researches products, ideas, and needs, and moderates online professional development seminars on a variety of healthcare-specific operations management topics. Patrick has also been working at Dude Solutions for over the past 5 years. It's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Patrick, who will begin the presentation.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Drew, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Patrick Tierney. I'm happy to be here and happy to be talking on the subject. I'm going to cover a quick agenda on some things of the way that we're going to lay this out here today. Obviously, we've gone through some welcome and some introductions already. Then we're going to move on to cover a little bit of background on what this session is really designed to be and why we thought this would be a good idea to put this on. Then we'll get a little bit more into that C-suite analysis, talk about what we more often see as far as their goals, who they are. Then we'll start to talk a little bit about data and really that precious resource that I think is so critical these days and where that kind of ties into your interactions with the C-suite. Start to bring in some other metrics and some things that we found are also important. And then we'll finish things up with just a closing few statements, some Q&A. I believe you should be able to post your questions in the chat feature of the program here today. So I'd love to answer some things at the end and hear from you folks as far as kind of what's on your mind. So with that, we'll jump into a poll question here. I wanted to get a feel before we jumped into the whole presentation of kind of how you're looking at your relationships with your C-suite right now. If you had to describe it, is it 100% in sync? You guys are 100% on the same page? Would you say it's good? You have great communication, but maybe there's a little bit of room for improvement? Would you say it's decent? It's on again, off again, depending on time of year? It's not really that good at all. You don't really understand each other more often than not, or you just say it's outright terrible. You don't understand each other at all. So I'd love to hear from you all in the attendance here, and so at least I can get a feel for where everyone stands. We'll give you just a few more seconds to submit your responses there. Okay. All right, so hopefully that's enough time for everyone to think through their relationship here. Hopefully we can post those results and have a look and see how everyone responded. Looks like there's kind of a mix across the board here. I don't see anyone at 100%, so hopefully that means you're at the right session here today. So we've got some good, decent, some not goods, so across the board. And again, that's expected. I think depending on your size of your facility, how long you've been there, there's a lot of factors that go into that relationship. But hopefully that gets you in that frame of mind of, what was your last conversation with them? Did it go well? Did it go not so well? But ideally, what's happening is that you're really synced up, that you're going in the same direction. You've got a lot of the same things in mind. You understand each other's mission, right? And you can communicate those needs effectively. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So as we'll kind of unpack this a little bit, you're not on the same page, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. But ideally, if you're more experienced, you've got your acumen down for facilities, you're building inside and out from your side, but they're running a whole slew of other things. Facilities might be just a portion as far as, they have a whole slew of other departments that report up to them. You're just maybe one of them, and they don't always understand what you're going through as well. So as we go through that, one of the things that I found is an issue is really a problem with perception. So there's a couple schools of thought here. One being that the facility director is always that hero. You're the one that always gets the call at 2 in the morning when there's a water main that's busted or there's a major issue, and you come out of nowhere, the bat signal's up, you solve the problem, and you go back to the bat cave and wait for the next, kind of issue to come up, right? There's another school of thought where you are the villain. You are the bearer of bad news. If something's breaking, if you show up, you're coming like the Grim Reaper with bad news. Truth be told, I really don't think those are really accurate one way or the other. It's probably more of a mix of things. So when I think about it, at least my experience with facility directors, they're a mix of things to include being very strategic. You have the ability to look at big picture and understand what's maybe best for your department from a strategic perspective. You're a creative problem solver in many cases. You're faced with limited resources, so you have to get creative in ways that you're solving those problems. In many cases, you're passionate, and I think some of that becomes the reality is you could be a facility director anywhere. You could be somewhere that's less stressful or more regulated or less complicated. But the fact is you chose to be in healthcare. So that shows that you likely have a passion for what you do, that your job is really encompassing of keeping patients safe. So I think there's something to be said for that. You're likely a steward of resources. So, you have limited a budget to work with, so you have to kind of stretch things from time to time, to put it lightly. So for hospitals, I think we found that the number one line item for expenses is typically paying your staff, but right behind that is capital infrastructure, which is being serviced by you. So that's a critical item to keep in mind, and these are all things that I think we found with lots of directors that's more reality of who you are. As we think about the larger picture, though, there's a lot of times a resource problem. You're forced to cut costs and things because you're seen as a cost center. The clinical mission of a lot of hospitals, it's focused on patient care, the clinical side, the things that's going to bring in money. So they look for other areas where they could potentially cut costs, and unfortunately, facilities is one of those ones that falls under the buzzsaw. So there becomes this tug of war between clinical to say, we want this, we want that. Well, who ends up winning? So that's kind of what the major topic is kind of leading us towards, is how do you get what you're looking for? And I think what's emerged over the years is you're getting by with kind of this perception of you have this amount of resources and you're making it work. And then the reality actually is you probably need a lot more than what you actually have. If you have 7 technicians, you probably need 8 or 9. If you have X amount of budget to replace capital assets, you probably need another, a couple million if we're being truthful. But there becomes this gap that starts to really emerge that shows, we have this, we actually need this, but everyone just thinks that, we're okay with what we have. But if you're on the call, you likely know that that's probably not the truth. We're going to take something in mind like this MRI machine. This is something that's going to have a huge impact on patient care and revenue generation. It's going to further the mission of the organization overall. This is what you're up against, right? So the people in the C-suite who are making decisions on what the hospital will buy, this is what you're up against. Versus, your side where you're asking for something like a roof, right? So it's not as attractive as an MRI machine. It's not going to have as direct an impact on patient care unless this roof were to fail or have a catastrophic failure. Then you're in that position where there's a major impact to many patients, and this might be something that you're asking to your C-suite. You're having a meeting and you're saying, we need to have a new roof. We're this close to having a major incident. So the question becomes, how do you start to provide some of that information to make your case, right? So this is what you're always up against. So we'll talk about some ways that I think can be useful to present to get what you're looking for. And the first way I'd say that that's going to be a reality is by using data. We had done a webinar in the past with HFM, and I think based on some of the polls that we had, about 2/3 of the respondents had their request denied at least once due to lack of justification. 2/3. So what that tells us is that you need data to support that funding request, and that's going to be critical for approval. If you're going straight for the ask and you're always getting turned down, that's an issue. You have those hunches, those thoughts, those feelings where I think this thing is going to fail, and if that happens, that's going to be a major problem. But what the C-suite is more often looking for is facts and figures. So that's going to be key as you start to think about what to present to them the next time around. That's some of what we're looking at. But first, let's take a little closer look as far as C-suite. So at least in my job functions, I'm talking to engineers and people in the C-suite almost on a daily basis as part of my day-to-day. And some of the observations, at least I've been able to pull from that and other resources that are available, is that it's lonely at the top, right? Poor C-suite, right? So they're higher up. They've got less people to bounce off their ideas. So they're presented with budget requests and things like that, and they're having to make decisions, but it's hard for them to turn to the next person over and say, what do you think? Because ultimately they're sitting on top of the mountain. And when they're looking at making these decisions, they're trying to look at this from the big picture, which is they're trying to think these decisions that are going to impact every department in one way, shape, or form, what's going to be the best for my company as a whole, my hospital. One of the things that I marked down that I think is valuable is being curious, asking questions, finding out, gaining insight by asking them, if you're having your regular meetings, what kind of projects or initiatives are they working on? What is their understanding of what you're doing on the facility side? So asking certain questions to see where they stand, because they might be focused on a new renovation or an add-on to the building. They're not even nearly as concerned about you because you're handling things on a day-to-day. It's business as usual until it's not. But based on where their mind share is, might help you to understand a way to approach things. Now, I'd say obviously there's no one-size-fits-all. Every CEO is going to have a different communication style or preference. There's no silver bullet in how you approach leadership. It'd be nice if there were, but I don't believe there is. So in lieu of that, what I can say is that we can start to think about different personality types that exist. And I think when we think about executives, that they fall into those two categories that you can see on the right. They're more oftenly considered drivers or really analytical. Are they more like, if you're a driver, they want to know what results they're going to get. If you're coming to them with an idea, they want to know what is the net result if I said yes to this. So you got to have that kind of information at the ready. If they're very analytical, they might want to have just a bucket load of numbers that you're presenting to them. So based on your calculations, your projections, that's the information that they're going to need to say yes to your request. But again, I think this is going to vary across the board. You may already read one of these and say, yep, that sounds just like my guy. But it's an important thing to think about if you're trying to get what you want. going back to that idea of data, this is becoming the new economy. This is one of the most highly coveted commodities that's out there right now. It's a very precious resource, not just for even just facilities, as we're talking about it today, but think about the other data, type analytics and programs that exist out there. We're talking about EMRs. We're talking about accounting programs. They're looking at all those different data centers and saying, what can I pull from those programs data-wise to help me to have that knowledge to make the right actions? I think ultimately leadership wants to make those data-driven decisions. So while you might be coming to them with opinions that are likely valid, they might be somewhat unsupported if you don't have the data to go along with it. So one of the things that I was going over as we were getting this information together was some of the studies that have been done in the past about what facilities have as far as information in their CMMS, their maintenance software. Because ultimately, if we go back over the data, and this was based from ASHI-IFMA Benchmarking 2.0 study back in 2017, that found that of the facilities out there, hospitals across the country, 83% of them were using a CMMS, which seems great. But if we look closer into the numbers, you start to see that of that 80%, the numbers were much lower for important metrics that are being tracked within the software. So only 31% of these facilities are tracking things like response times for work requests. So how quickly are we responding to patient requests? Only 39% are tracking the percentage of work orders that are closed on time. So these are critical metric points to look at if I'm trying to talk about justifying more staff, or if we're looking at how efficient we're being with our time. But if I look at these numbers, I'm saying these are way too low. That tells me the CMMS is being heavily underutilized as a whole. That's across the board for all programs. So these are telling numbers that I think existed as they came out there a couple years ago. If we look at a couple more numbers that exist in the space that are more cost-driven, think about do you know what your maintenance cost per square foot is? National average has it at around $5 a square foot. Some of the best can get that maybe closer to $1.40 per month or per square foot. Same kind of metrics exist within the utility spend category. So I put these numbers up just to get you thinking, do you know where you're at right now as it relates to these numbers, cost per square foot? If you don't know, why don't you think you have that information? Why is that not available? And if you do have this number, where do you fall in this range? Are you above it? Are you below it? Are there areas for improvement, or is it time to say, look, I'm doing fantastic in this, and maybe it's maybe time for some recognition, right? So the point is, if you know this information, you're going to be in a better place to chart your path for improvement and set those goals. If you don't know where you rank, I don't know how you can set those appropriate goals. So this is hopefully some food for thought to see where you stand and where you kind of chart forward. So for the next few slides, I'm just going to highlight some of the KPIs that we recommend to our clients when we're bringing them on board and saying, these are valuable metrics that you should be set up with to be in a better position to see where you go forward. So we're talking about things around productivity and responsiveness. How many work orders are you completing per month, but also how many hours are being logged by each technician, right? So if you can look at that, it can help you to understand, are there certain anomalies that are popping up within your workforce? Do you have a case to be made for another FTE based on these numbers? Another key perspective might be from a cost side, right? So like if you're, like most facility directors I talk to, you're no longer just responsible for maintenance at one building. Likely you're responsible for multiple buildings or clinics, and you have multiple departments rolling up to you. So we're going to set you up with metrics and things that analyze cost per site. We're looking for an apples-to-apples comparison, and you're also looking for certain trends by categories. Think HVAC versus electrical versus plumbing, and you're looking for specific spikes in costs in a specific area. And then based on that, maybe you can start to, say, hey, I'm seeing a real uptick here. I need to look closer into this problem and analyze my own data, and then start to make some corrections based on this. Maybe you're outsourcing too much. Maybe you have really old infrastructure, like I expect many do, but that's leading to additional cost in this place. Another one would be as relates to your assets and what needs to be repaired versus what needs to be replaced. So like we talked about earlier with the roof replacement request, just being able to support your claim that something needs to be replaced. So being able to know what you have, identify those thresholds. If it is going to cross over a certain amount of the original purchase cost as far as your repairs, do we have a case now to replace that asset, right? This is the data that can help you with your capital planning, your budgeting for future years upcoming. Another key KPI we recommend to our clients revolves around that idea of managing your environment of care and tracking it as it relates to the deficiencies that you're finding in there. If you're over facilities, likely you play a part within this environment of care in doing those walkthroughs and those safety audits. So having this information to show leadership where you're seeing improvement based on the number of deficiencies being found in specific areas, identifying where you might enact new procedures or do staff education, that stuff is huge, right? So if you have this information, you're much more likely to be able to create strategies and initiatives going forward. But it has to be tracked somewhere. It has to be captured and analyzed in a way that is easily digestible. So the question becomes, do you know your own numbers, right? So from my favorite cartoon back in the 80s of G.I. Joe, knowing is really half the battle. So it's a good time to stop and think about this. Do you have these numbers? We talked about maintenance per square foot, the cost associated there, number of requests, your turnaround times. The big one is asset inventory. It's usually not a day or two goes by where I'm not, I'm talking to a site that says we don't really have a full asset inventory. We have a pretty good list. We've transferred from other programs and we've lost something in translation, or we've replaced equipment, but we never really updated it in our inventory. So that's a good place as any to ask yourself, do I have all of my equipment in my software database? Is it up to date? Do I know the age and the condition of those assets? Even just having a good work history against all those equipment can be a struggle. You might have some of the PMs that are tied to those assets because those are going to pop up every month, every quarter, you knock them out. But do you have the corrective history against it? Every time it's broken down, are your technicians going through and linking those breakdowns back to that equipment? And then lastly, as far as risk assessment, are you tracking those risk assessments in your software program? I'll talk to sites where they have this tracked in a completely different spreadsheet, not necessarily linked to their CMMS. So I think there's a lot of value in having it all located in one place so that you can run analytics on those assets to include the asset rankings. So ultimately, this comes back to you can't measure what you're not capturing. Again, back to that benchmarking report. I think this information is so low because even people that have CMMSs, they're still tracking things on paper. So ultimately, the goal would be to have programs in place that have work request management, planned maintenance, and hopefully some that have PM scheduling that has things like the elements of performance built in, things that have your assets managed within that program but also have the risk assessments that have, if you're running AEMs, that those are being listed against your assets. That if you have equipment that's related to infection control, that it's being labeled as such, so that it can be treated with the proper amount of requirements, as it relates to compliance. Are you able to do environment of care rounding within your program? The reports, the analytics, a lot of this ties back to being ready for a Joint Commission survey. And so while the topic of what we're discussing today is really tying back to your C-suite and having reporting for them, I would make the argument that that information is just as important for the surveyors, because that's what your C-suite is going to be interested in is, did we receive any citations, deficiencies from survey? Hopefully if you have the programs in place to support your data audits as that comes through with things like Joint Commission survey, that you have good news for your C-suite. And hopefully a lot of this information, it's not being tracked on paper, and that you would think about the idea of tracking this as it happens, right? So thinking of mobile technology to leverage so that you're able to document these things as they happen. It's much more popular these days using smartphones and tablets. You're going to have better data because things are being tracked in real time versus someone that's logging hours and inventory and notes at the end of a day in front of a computer while they're trying to, run out of the building for their kid's soccer game. I'd rather have them doing it during the day as opposed to an afterthought at 5 o'clock. And ultimately, if they're using things like mobile technology to complete their day-to-day tasks, they're going to be more productive, they're going to have more wrench time, and you're really kind of empowering your staff to be the most productive employee that they can be and give you better data in the process. So as relates to project justification, I think there's some buzzwords that at least I think I consistently hear: cost analysis, or risk analysis, cost reduction, and ROI. Those are things that I think are critical to speak to. So things like risk analysis, talking about revenue loss. Speak to the financial ramifications of a major equipment breakdown. Those are the things that will perk the ears up of someone in the C-suite. If you're just giving them, here's what I think the average revenue loss would be if the top level of our hospital was shut down for a period of 7 days because we had a catastrophic failure here, the interruption to business. Those are things that I think catch their attention. The bad press, the idea of reducing costs, so potential savings. So outlining, if we were to do, say, this project, we'll take something like a lighting retrofit. You want to switch over to LED lights. Obviously, there's going to be a cost up front for that kind of thing. But that ultimately, if you can give them numbers that say it will pay itself off after 3, 4, 5 years, well, then you just laid out a case for them to say yes, ultimately. Another example might be to bring in a skilled technician versus always contracting a certain trade out, right? So if you can make a case that it's going to save you money, and that while it might be a hit to train someone new and to give benefits to a new HVAC technician, but that ultimately it would help you to recoup that money in a certain period of time, those are more of the concepts that your CFOs and your CEOs are much more likely to be open to. So give them a story, give them some context as relates to some of this information. Let's look at some examples of data you can bring to justify specific requests. So I mentioned a couple of these, but say you have some areas that you're looking for around like staffing needs. Things that I think of that you can bring can be the amount of work and think time spent, number of work orders for your maintenance team, what kind of responsiveness that you have as it stands, if you're measuring it, reporting it, and then saying, look, we have certain SLAs that we like to adhere to for things like patient requests. I think that we, based on my data, I think we'd be better served to have another technician so that our responsiveness gets a bit of an uptick there. I'd also bring information around your staff productivity. The first question they're going to ask is, well, how productive is the staff that you have now? Why can't you do what you want with the 7 technicians that you have today? So being able to produce some analytics around the productivity and that everyone is completing the number of jobs that they should be and attributing the hours to that, well, I think that says something. And then also looking at the percent of work that's contracted out. I think it's useful to split that out by category. I think there's certain trades like elevator and some others where ultimately there's not a ton of skilled labor that relates back to those specific types of work, that it's hard to find skilled labor. But if you can make a case and say, we are paying out a ton to these 3 HVAC vendors, and we're farming out 80% of that work. We're doing very little in-house. Then I think you are raising a case to say we can handle this in-house, right? So that would be for staffing needs. There might be cases where you are trying to make that argument for capital replacement needs. So I think this is about getting them on the same side as you, on the same side of the table, and saying, look, I'm going to be honest, here's my inventory, here's some of the condition that some of these things are in, here's the work history associated, the total cost of ownership as it relates to those items for this boiler, for this chiller, and what have we paid for, right? So I talked to a site earlier where they were laughing, and I can't blame them, but he's like, we were talking about this concept of capital planning. He's like, I probably have vans that I've bought 7 times over, right? So I was like, if you could just take some of that information and show it to your leadership, maybe you can find that compromise and say, look, if I can't replace it, right this minute, right this, this week or month, what about if we could slate this to be replaced in the fall, right? Or after our fiscal hits in October. So maybe finding some compromise on those replacement dates. Also, as it relates to safety and compliance data, right? I think this information is more critical than ever. And a lot of it has probably fallen on your shoulders. So thinking about, are you prepared for surveys? Have you done your due diligence and being vigilant about patient safety? Are you getting the most out of your assets? Are you saving energy? Even being able to pull out patient satisfaction. Pulling out that data, I think it's something that more sites are more conscientious of. So sending out surveys to the patients to go, how was your stay? Did you feel safe? Was it a comfortable, healing environment? That's pointing right back to those HCAP scores that you're dealing with. So having some of that data available can be crucial in these situations. So really this comes back to, again, just telling your story, right? So if you think about if you saw year-over-year reductions, talk about the policies that you put in place to impact those reductions. What kind of staff education did you put in place that made a difference? If you saw different trends in your utility spend, what did you do? Were you having certain policies in place that you said after it hits June, I was telling people not to crank down the thermostats or to leave their lights on after they left the office? What things could you and did you put in place to affect that change? And maybe you did something where you looked at how can you get some performance improvement. Maybe you said, with our program, we started using more mobile technology, and because of that, we found these efficiency gains for each technician that was using mobile. So really making a case to maybe get some more devices or to further encourage your staff to adopt that technology. So it's really kind of telling your story. So as I've been preaching all about this importance of data, obviously we need to acknowledge that there's other factors, and the primary one is really compassion. Re-emphasizing that you do care about the hospital and knowing that your work keeps patients safe when they are healing. So I think it's important to define your department's mission and and the vision of that department. What is your approach to service? Talk to your C-suite about how much you value your responsibility to patients and the part that you play. And I think this does provide an emotional impact. And the reality is that you're not maintaining a storage facility. You're not maintaining a warehouse. You're maintaining a space that has patients and they're healing. And I think that matters. And it probably matters for a lot of the people on the call today. So again, the goal is, everyone's synced up. Everyone's working together. And when we know where we stand and speak the same language, we know where we need to be. And ideally, each party understands the other's mission, and you're able to communicate effectively and timely as relates to this. So obviously, the Works Hub and Dude Solutions, we're a software provider, and that goes beyond just communicating to leadership. We really offer a full suite of best-in-class healthcare-specific software that's helped a lot of our hospitals and facility directors to solve many of the problems and issues that I've covered here in the last 30 minutes. So at this time, it might be helpful to introduce a poll here, and I'll turn it over to Drew to kind of touch on that. And what I really, as we kind of come to our close here, it might be helpful to ask the question, do you want more information on the Works Hub and maybe where we can help on some of these topics? Would it be helpful to have a private demonstration? We hold these every day. Or would it maybe just a white paper that kind of sheds some light on some of the things that we're doing here? So we'll allow for some time for you to respond here and to get some more information.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. We'll leave this poll open for further responses here for the next few minutes. So we'll now begin the question and answer portion of today's event. As a reminder, you may submit a question for our speaker in the question and answer box to the left of the presentation. Simply type your question in the box and hit submit. Our speaker will answer as many questions as possible in the time remaining. Questions that are unable to be answered in our allotted time will be shared with the speaker for follow-up offline. So Patrick, first question I see here. My organization currently utilizes a CMMS, but we are having trouble getting technician buy-in to properly track the work. This would help us in gathering the data for proper benchmarking. Do you have any examples of how to best approach or sell this to get the technicians to buy in?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is something we come across quite a bit. The nature of facilities, there's probably some folks that you can think of in your organization that aren't used to using things like mobile technology. So I think that bringing them into the fold of trust is big. If you're talking to your technicians and they know that doing things like tracking their time is going to be key if you're going to justify the existing FTE positions that you have, but maybe even getting more to kind of lessen the load on everybody. If they know that you need help collecting data on things like assets, you can help prove the case to replace instead of continuously repairing. They're more likely to buy in if you've explained some of that stuff to them and said, if you're doing this, this is going to help us with staffing and not having to patch every piece of equipment, that we might actually get some new things. So I think just being transparent probably goes a long way.
Great. Another question for you. You mentioned that keeping data within the hub, not separately in Excel. Can you provide more info on that?
Yeah. So I think there's a case where, and this happens with a lot of people, that they're sort of tracking things in separate places, like you mentioned, kind of spreadsheets or otherwise. So by consolidating all that information, you can run more full and comprehensive analytics. So things like your PM completion percentages, your total cost of ownership. If some of this is being tracked separately in spreadsheets, I just don't know that you get really the full picture. So I think there's a lot of benefit in really consolidating that information.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in around when you were discussing benchmarking. So their C-suite is big on that. What areas or metrics do you recommend benchmarking against?
Yeah, great question. So as far as some of the recommended benchmarks that I've seen that are helpful, this could be the one metric that we talked about, the cost of maintenance per square foot. That's a great one to look at so you can see if your spend is that much higher than maybe the national averages. I'd look at your responsiveness to patient requests. I think there's some metrics that exist out there that can kind of steer you to help you to understand if you're close to those national averages. The cost of your life safety programs. So I think there's a lot of great ones out there, and we're happy to talk to anyone else again after this call if you want to find out what more of those benchmarks are.
Wonderful. Another question for you: How do you get buy-in from executives to be given funds to replace old and worn-out equipment that doesn't necessarily track data? So we're talking furniture, flooring, other things in the hospital.
Yeah, good question. So yeah, we might not be looking at equipment data or work order data, but there's still some information that could be used. So having some benchmarks in place, like how often do other hospitals replace carpeting or flooring? So I think that there's a case to be made that executives, they're like we talked about, kind of the top of the pyramid, right? So they're up there, they're going, what are other hospitals doing? Having some benchmarks in place just might give you here's what everyone else is doing, which is what I find is kind of most common. So yeah, I think that if you can kind of lay out a case for that and understand what the rest of the country is doing, there's certainly a case to be made.
Okay, great. I think that wraps up the time we have available today. If you would like to download the presentation, please do so using the resources pod on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Thank you so much, Patrick Tierney, for your presentation, and thank you to our sponsor, Dude Solutions. Please take a moment momentarily to fill out our survey that will pop up. That concludes today's program, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's presentation. You may now disconnect your phone lines and log off of the webinar.